So one of the fundamental questions that drives all of our collaborative work with scientists, including cell and molecular biologists, material scientists, mechanical engineers, physicists, mathematicians, plant biologists, and beyond, is to look at how buildings and their integrated material systems may behave more like organisms do, interacting and responding and adapting to their natural environments. So I did start as an artist. Initially, when I started college, I thought I wanted to go into a pre-med track. I started in biology and chemistry. My parents are artists at heart. Maybe that was my own form of rebellion. But I quickly realized that also wasn't the right fit. So I went into the fine arts, and specifically working on a BFA in ceramics and a BA in interdisciplinary visual arts, and then practiced as an artist in Seattle, Washington, where I'm from originally, working at the Seattle Art Museum during the day to pay the bills and working in the studio at night. And there were sort of two things that I grappled with. One, I felt sort of overwhelmed by the fact that it was ultimately up to me to decide what I would make in my studio. And I really longed to have more collaborators. I wanted to engage with other parameters that perhaps could sit outside of my own art practice. And the other part of that, too, was my ongoing interest in bringing together science, mathematics, technology, and the fine arts. And so architecture seemed like a really kind of logical fit. And so I shut down my studio and took a physics course at night, which was the last course that I needed to apply to graduate school in architecture, and ended up doing my master's in architecture professional degree program at the University of Pennsylvania from 2002 to 2005. And it was a really interesting time because during my graduate education, the department and the school were also integrating digital technologies and emerging technologies into the curriculum. And so the first half of my education, I was learning the fundamentals of drawing and notation systems, which for me as a maker was a good bridge. Learning the art of ink on mylar and 1, 2, 3-point perspective, etc. And then the second half, I was studying with people who now one of my most important mentors, Cecil Baumond, learning how to script and write algorithms, and I found the glove that fit. It was just really kind of mind-blowing. And I was an older student, so I knew what I wanted, and I made some really great friendships and connections with faculty, and I was fortunate to be invited to teach shortly after. So one of the fundamental questions that drives all of the work is how might buildings and their integrated material relationships and systems engage with and respond to their environments, much like organisms do in nature. And so we look at biological systems, we look at material systems, concepts such as structural color, to then transfer those behaviors and processes to an architectural scale. So oftentimes we look at what is responsive versus adaptive. So an adaptive system will change and evolve over time. And so I'm really interested in how architecture may behave more like an organism does in terms of not only responding to, but adapting and learning from their natural environments over longer time scales. They're very special. These are 3 different species from South America. So these butterflies are important to me because of the makeup of their wings in terms of the patterning and the geometry. And the color that you see here, this kind of brilliant, iridescent kind of gradient of blues, is due to what's called structural color. And so what is happening at a nanoscale is that at a particular wavelength of light, there are changes happening within the patterns and the textures in terms of how that light is reflecting and refracting. And so at a human scale, we perceive a change in color. And that might be a dynamic switch from opaque to transparent, or what you see here, these kind of brilliant blues. And so we've been exploring for years now with material scientists, together with my collaborators, including engineers and biologists, how we might transfer those nanoscale behaviors and characteristics into an architectural scale. For me as a professor of architecture and also within that, importantly, an educator, the research is front and center. I think at the end of the day, my biggest impact will be made through my teaching and getting students to think a bit differently about how they approach design, to take moments to look outside of their own discipline, to draw inspiration from nature, and to approach pressing questions and problems with expansiveness. So a former student of mine, Nice, is coming together with a group of her students. She's now teaching architecture studios, and they're curious to see what we're up to in the lab together with my collaborators here at Cornell University. Hello.
Hi, Jenny.
Great to see you.
Very nice
to see you. Been forever, yeah. It'll be cozy. So my name's Jenny Sabin. I'm a professor of architecture and also part of the inaugural faculty for Design Tech, which is a new multi-college department that cuts across 5 colleges and multiple departments. And so a primary mission for the department is to conduct research collaboratively and to teach across disciplinary boundaries. That's, I think, where I'll make my biggest impact. But in terms of what gets me going every day, I love teaching, I love engaging with the students, but the core research and my collaborators, working across disciplines, being sort of like exposed to, entirely different ways of approaching some of the things that we may take for granted in design is, what keeps me going every day. And so I wear many different hats. I have different roles here at Cornell University. Again, first and foremost as an educator, teaching design studios and seminars. Sometimes, very traditionally focused on architecture and many other times focused on the core collaborative work that I do. And then I'm also principal investigator within the Sabin Design Lab, which is where I bring students into fundamental research together with colleagues in plant science, biology, mathematics, physics, where we're approaching new strategies for responsive and adaptive architecture. And then in my practice, through Jenny Sabin Studio, we're able to take those concepts and research arcs that have reached a certain maturation over, say, 4 years into application, and to engage with diverse publics that otherwise wouldn't be exposed to what we're doing in the lab. So that bridge between the research, the lab, and the studio and the world, really is fundamental to what gets me up every morning and excited. But again, at the core of that are my students. We've been looking at how we can take design drivers coming from human bone formation into our bricks. And bone is a really incredible, resilient system. So if we were to look at a CT scan of a cross-section of a runner versus a bicyclist versus a swimmer, the density of that bone is going to look very different, right, based on those repeated load events. We think that's a pretty cool way to think about bricks, right? So there's the kind of optimization side of it. So how we can optimize for load paths. So imagine a wall where at the base of the wall, you have thick struts to carry greater loads, but then as it goes up the wall, it gets increasingly lighter and more porous. And in nature, the paradox of building with holes, right, you see everywhere, right? So taking, again, incredibly lightweight but very robust systems as a point of departure, as an analog, right? And thinking about brick structures. Well, in many ways, the connections between the digital, the physical, and the biological define what is a really kind of big paradigm shift in the ways that our disciplines are converging. And also you see that present in the discipline of architecture, especially in how we make and construct. So, for example, some historians say that, we are being repositioned, and we being architects, as makers again, and that hasn't happened, really since the medieval period. And that's precisely because of the technologies that we now have at hand. So, for example, typically you think of an architect as authoring drawings, the plan, section, elevation, the tools, the notation systems that we use to communicate information about form that then someone else builds, right? So in some ways you could say that the building is a copy of what the architect authors. Mario Carpo, amazing historian and dear friend and colleague, has written extensively about the lineage of these topics, from Brunelleschi to Alberti to now to robots and scripting. But with the advent of 3D printing, being able to write an algorithm for a robotic arm to control its toolpath, we're now in a position to design and make in a much more fluid and real-time way. So we're not just authoring drawings, we're authoring the whole kind of system for how we design, make, materialize, and formalize what we're working on at any given moment. And in the context of that paradigm, and my expertise in design and emerging technologies, turning to nature to extract design drivers and ways of opening up new approaches in that paradigm has been incredibly powerful, because in natural systems, geometry, materiality, making, feedback, program, history, all of that is inextricably linked. And that has presented for years now a very powerful set of ecological models and design drivers and thinking models to bring back into architecture. And so for the fusion of the digital, the biological, the physical, is very much rooted in that engagement. So for me, this project, Polyform, is a really excellent example of responsive architecture, precisely because of its siting and the people that engage with it. And I think for me, the most sort of meaningful part of it is seeing how people engage with the project. It's become a real destination on campus. Just this past weekend, over the graduation weekend, people were, graduating students were bringing their families and taking photos, and it's one of the most Instagrammed project on campus, whatever that means, but people come and hang out. And so there's something about the special materials, the different qualities of the structures. When you pass through this threshold, you leave the kind of Cartesian world of architecture that we know into something that becomes more organic and different from what we engage with day to day, that I think is actually closer to how we are as people. And so there's something to that inspires people to gather and take a moment. And I hear this all the time from staff, faculty, students who make it a point to have Polyform be a part of their daily schedule. I think this project, in terms of what it says about me as an architect, comes back to one of the fundamental questions that I pose that drives a lot of the work, which is how might buildings and their integrated material relationships behave and respond more like natural organisms do in their contexts, as a dynamic set of feedback loops. And I think the promise of that, architecturally, for us as people, and also in the context of sustainability and some of the pressing questions that we're faced around climate change, answer dual need. One is about aesthetics and beauty and wonder and community and engagement, and the other is about changing conditions and how the architecture that we inhabit, needs to adopt a different model and needs to be more responsive and integrated, and therefore more resilient in their environment. So for me, this is a prototype. It's not a building, it's not sculpture, it's design, it's an architectural prototype for the future. Yeah, so my role as an educator and researcher is very much connected to what I do in practice. I'm very sort of interested and deeply invested in pushing the research into the built environment and looking at how what we're doing at a fundamental level collaboratively with scientists, how that is then informed by the real world. And that might be, site constraints. It may be working with communities and engaging in participatory design, where my systemic and relational and generative process can then take in other parameters and important voices. And for me, that's just where like incredible magic happens, where the work leaves the lab and engages in diverse urban communities. And some people say, well, you could just teach and do your research and that would be more than enough. But for me, that piece of the trajectory and arc of the work, meeting communities and meeting the built environment and really testing it at scale, is incredibly important, and then in turn informs what I'm doing in the lab and the research as a kind of dynamic set of feedback loops. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't think a whole lot about the spaces that they occupy, and the environments that we engage in impact who we are and our well-being and our own health and wellness. And what I'm doing in collaboration with scientists gives rise to new ways of assessing how those environments are impacting us as people through the spaces that we inhabit. And a lot of what we do in my practice is viewed as experimental, and we occupy kind of different phases. I would say one phase is within the realm of experimental structures, prototypes. We saw polyform earlier, and in my opinion, that's a great example of an architectural prototype of a series of systems that could then be scaled towards more permanent building structures. That is a permanent pavilion, but it could be scaled to something much larger. And so on the one hand, the responsive and at times adaptive materials engage issues of sustainability, thinking about how we might dynamically interact with the sun to reduce heat gain in buildings, with the grand mission of considering how buildings can behave more like organisms do, responding and adapting to their local environments. And then on the kind of more mature end of the practice work, we engage in truly adaptive environments. So projects that evolve over time, and Lumen is a great example of that. And in many ways, the materiality of that project is not complete without the engagement and interaction with people, right? And it was, during that project where, we incorporated a lot of research that was ongoing within the dynamics of light and energy and structural color into high-tech responsive fibers and digitally knitting strategies, that ultimately was realized as a project that had a formal aesthetic to it that appeared more organic, where edges are blurry, they're not hard corners or enclosed boundaries. It's an architecture that's much more informal and lateral and situated in its context, and that really resonated with people. A lot of the people who frequented Lumen, I think I mentioned, told me that they came every week to take their lunch or to bring their families or to meet up with friends. They talked about how they wished that it was in their child's playground or in a hospital. And so there's something about the architecture that results from the collaborative process that cuts across disciplinary boundaries, that resonates with people at a kind of core level. And some might call that biophilia. Maybe it's a different term, but for me as an architect, I'm deeply invested in what that is, both in terms of contributing to health and wellness, but also just inspiring moments of pause and wonder, and creating spaces that draw people together. And it might be like, wow, I've never seen that before, and what is that? What's going on here? And that allows people to look at their own contexts in maybe different ways, and to spark conversation, and maybe even at best inspire children to get involved with this type of work. So I think while it still resides at a highly experimental level, we're really thrilled to be getting commissions and clients who are really committed and on board to realizing the work at a permanent scale. And for the last 5 years, we've been taking on increasingly more projects that are permanent in urban settings. We've done some really exciting large canopy structures that have various types of programs. I think increasingly the role of architects in our society is, one that is about making connections. And, architects have always managed, a complex set of parameters and constraints. We then form a plan and a methodology for iterating and exploring in a rigorous way through those constraints and parameters. And oftentimes that means bringing different voices into the mix. But we're, I think, now finally seeing across disciplines and across practice and industry the relevance of design. Architects are terrible at seeing the value of what we have to offer. And design is elusive, but it is a skill, and it is taught, and it takes time to hone. And I think we're now at a point where we are realizing the value of design, and others are realizing the value of design. And that's where collaboration across disciplines, I think, it's all, the opportunity has always been there, but I think there are radical new approaches happening that are so exciting, where the role of the architect maybe isn't just about buildings, but maybe it's about working on cancer biology. Maybe it's about working on entirely new material systems that can become adaptive building skins. And I think that's not only the future, it's the now. I think for me, as an architectural designer that operates and collaborates across disciplines, nature is both a model and a teacher. but I'm also very interested in turning to nature as a collaborator, and to look at the interconnectedness of nature and how we are a part of that. And so in my research and in my design practice and my teaching, it's all about integrated relationships and systems. And so, we're designing not just for people, but also for other species. And part of that too is breaking down a paradigm that is so entrenched in our misconception of human dominance over nature. And that has resulted in horrific climate change, caused by humans for the first time. And so I think a more empathetic, collaborative approach that engages nature and in turn is informed by nature and specified by natural systems, whether it's as an analog or an abstraction or a mimicry, allows architects and my students and my teams and my collaborators to not only forge new openings and new technologies and new materials and scientific discoveries, but I think a deep empathy for interconnectedness that results in powerfully beautiful results.